Thank you for coming out. Really excited about I/O this year. It's almost like a dream come true for some of us. Unbelievable that we have the talent that we have out here. It's really humbling. So as Val said, I'm Wesley Grubbs. I lead a studio in Madison, Wisconsin called Pitch Interactive. And I've been asked this several times, and just to sort of make this clear, is Pitch Interactive is not just me. There are 4 of us. And without the help of Nick and Kemper and Tipo, we would not be where we are. So I just kind of help organize things and think through things and make stuff, but really it's definitely a group and collaborative effort from all of us. So to start off, this is my Twitter name, in case anyone likes to tweet during these kind of things. Pitch Interactive without the E. Character limitations. Didn't think it was a big deal at the time, but you know. And as Val said, I actually am going to start off with a test. Don't be afraid. It's a very interesting test just to kind of help us understand our brains a little bit better and how our brains reason cognitively with information, especially the information that we see. So what I'm going to do with this test is I'm going to show you 2 series of things. The first series is a sequence of 6 numbers and diagrams, just sort of one after the other. I'm going to show you them very quickly. So I want you to look at them and try to memorize them as best as you can. Don't write it down or anything like that. The next sequence of items I'm going to show you are going to be 6 images. And I just want you to look at those images and try to memorize those as well. And I'll explain everything when I'm done here. So I'm about to go through this very quick. Is everyone ready? Yeah, okay. Okay. You guys get that? Huh? The bar graphs, totally new work that we did. It's great. Actually, it was just Keynote. I just did quick bar graphs. Here's the next series of images that I want you to look at very quickly and try to memorize. Did you get that? Okay, now before I finish this test, I'm going to tell you a little story because I want us to think about something else for a little bit. We'll come back to it, and I'll make my point. So this is a picture of my desk in our studio in Madison. Madison is not too far from here, and it's not everyone knows Madison, obviously. It's definitely a nice little community in the Midwest, and it's very known. It's been in the media a lot recently in the last couple of months because of this. And trying to explain this, I was sort of going through some of these slides and trying to figure out how to explain a very political aspect that's been going on in Madison within a time span of a few minutes, and I realize it's not going to be very easy, so I'm going to give it my best shot. So this year, if anyone was watching Amanda Cox, we've had a lot of elections recently, like at the beginning of this year anyway. And there was a huge turnover from senators and congressmen that were Republicans, got a lot of gains. And one of those gains was the governor of Wisconsin. His name is Scott Walker. Before him, we had a pretty strong progressive liberal leadership within Wisconsin. And when Governor Walker came on, one of the very first things that he did, I think the very first thing he did, was submit a budget proposal plan that would basically it would gut the entire budget system that we have in Wisconsin. And one of the provisions in this plan was to eliminate union worker rights, and not just any union worker rights, but more specifically aimed at teacher unions. And I've heard a lot of different ideas about teacher unions, and this particular case, it's not that he was trying to improve the education system and he thought teacher unions were sort of lagging the system. He wanted to also cut $33 million from education funding in Wisconsin. So that naturally pissed off a lot of people. Madison, the capital of Wisconsin, has about 200,000 people and about 60,000 grad students at the UW in Madison. And it's very, very well known for its education system. Actually, Wisconsin has one of the better education systems in the country. And it's very proactive. Anyways, Scott Walker proposed this plan, and actually this is Scott Walker. I thought I would show him for just a minute. So, all right, here's the blank screen. I couldn't look at that very long either, but I sort of had to say the story. So Scott Walker proposed this plan. It was very, very controversial. And the thing about Madison is it's a very politically active city, especially for its size. The very first week that Scott Walker proposed this aspect, we had protesters coming up on the Capitol. Towards the end of this week, the number of protesters averaged around 120,000 people who were actually coming to the Capitol. Now, this is a city of a population of 200,000. So you can imagine the swell of population that sort of came into Madison at that. But one of the interesting aspects about it, one thing that really fascinated me is Scott Walker went on Fox News and was bragging about all the emails that he had received in support of his ideologies. And so the AP and a local newspaper in Madison called the Isthmus decided to ask Scott Walker for those emails. One really good thing that we do have in America is this open record system. So if you're in government office, you don't have this in every country. You can, technically, we need to have access to those emails and whatnot. So the AP and the Isthmus approached Scott Walker, hey, we want those emails you're talking about. You're not going to get them, was his response. They're like, cool, we'll sue you. So they sued him, they won, he got them. And this happened pretty quick. I have a friend at the Isthmus, and I emailed my friend Jason there, and I said, hey, you have emails? You know what I do? Do I need to say anything more? And he's like, no, dude, totally, here you go. I did have to sign a clause because I can't show people's names and their address and contact information because there are some safety concerns, understandably. But anyway, so we had about 50,000 emails to go through. And first of all, the emails were put in a mess. And I don't even have slides to show it, and I'll spare you the needles poking in your eyeballs for how this information was organized. It was just a ton of text files that were just, all these emails were just sort of smashed together in such a way that sometimes they were like smashed, they were like cut and paste and mid-email. So we didn't have a really good delimiter, like in order to blow the emails out to try to separate them all individually and put them in a database. But we finally figured out how to do that, and we started going through these emails, and these were just some of the samples that we saw. So this was one, you know, stay the fight, do not cave, your enemy is Satin, you know. I'm like, looking at this like, okay, is that a compliment? Oh wait, you misspelled it. You know, another one, very typical one too, like we support you. This is a Ronald Reagan moment. Fire all the teachers. In 1982, there was a union protest of air traffic controllers that came up. They wanted their special rights. And not to go too much into detail, Ronald Reagan was the president. Everyone knows he's a Republican hero. And Ronald Reagan came out and said, you have 48 hours to get back to work. If you don't do it, I'm going to fire you. And it, you know, his sort of cowboy move. And that's what they're saying, Scott Walker, do this to all the teachers. And he actually issued a bunch of pink slips, threatening the teachers that he was going to fire them if they didn't return. The schools in Madison were closed for, what was it, 2 weeks or something? I mean, it was a very, very active, and it's still going on. Unfortunately, just yesterday, after all of this fighting, it's gone through the courts, he actually won, and he did sign his budget proposal plan. So now, I think as of today, teachers' unions are eliminated. And so now schools are trying to rework, you know, hey, how did people do school systems in 1890? Let's go back to that and see. This is one against Scott Walker, you know, the traditional Canadian-esque democratic. You know, please have a dialogue with your peers, please cooperate, please, you know, and then the other guys that are like, hey, Scott, you know. And then we have like these obscure ones in this whole list that's like, hey, I'd very much like to receive your autograph. Please send it to me mail. I'd be very glad to your autograph. Best regards, Oleg from Russia. Okay. You know, how do we do this? How do we go through this data and sort this? How do we determine whether an email is for or against? And I've been working with quite a few data sets from various clients where they have like a sentiment value in an email. Like, hey, we're analyzing Twitter feeds or Facebook comments. We have a sentiment value. And I always ask, well, what the hell does sentiment mean? Does that mean they're happy or they like your product? What's the algorithm for that? When I started understanding how they were doing that, I realized it's a big pile of dog poo. I mean, it just doesn't work. The sentiment value is too abstract, too obscure. And I was starting to look into natural language processing, even looked at IBM's Watson. You know, would Watson be able to take care of this? To read an email and determine whether or not that email is for or against. You can't really do pattern detection either. And even if we were to use a sentiment value, almost everyone who writes to Scott Walker is pissed, whether they're for him or against him. They're either pissed at him or they're pissed at the Democrats and they think they should be fired. So, except for this guy, he's not very pissed. So what would he be, for or against? You know, and it's actually, he needs to be categorized and they does not apply. So we took it upon ourselves to build an online, or not really an online, it was local, but we built a little app in the studio to go through each email manually. And this is sort of the stats of some of the stuff that we were working on. This is not pretty, and it's not supposed to be. It's sort of like what Maurice was saying earlier, don't focus on design up front. Focus on the data and understand that data as you're working through it. You can see here, there was a total of workable emails. Some of the emails we just had to filter out of almost 46,000 emails that we had. That's a lot. We managed to manually process about almost 30,000. So just going through those is literally like reading an email and then having a tag. Is this for or against Scott Walker? Is this in state or out of state? This way, this was between us and the studio. We asked some of the people at the Isthmus to help us out, people we trusted, people who we could rely on to be objective, and not just to be like, oh, these bastards, I'm going to just, you know, click them and put them somewhere else. But this is sort of the stats up to this point. And from what we have, so you have like 59.1% are in support of Scott Walker of the entire data set. 38.1 against, this little green is not applicable. You can see here there's a lot more in-state and against Scott Walker and a lot more out-of-state that are for Scott Walker. I hope I'm not mixing these up as I'm talking. But here was the issue that I had. The emails were released. 2 days later, a local paper in Madison called Madison.com released an article. It was basically, is Scott Walker telling the truth? He came out to national media and he was saying, a majority of my emails say I should do this, so I'm going to do it. And Madison.com came out with an article saying he's correct. He had 65% of the people in support of him. And as I was reading that article, I was like, well, I don't like to hear that. I kind of wish he was lying and he was full of shit, because then I can say, you see. But of course, it was still interesting. I was trying to understand from this article, how do they understand that? Because this data, we've been working with it. It's really not that easy to analyze it. So what they explained in there is they took a sample set of 1,000 emails from the entire set. How they grabbed that sample, I'm very curious about. But one thing in data visualization that people have to understand is you have to understand statistics. Even not at a super in-depth level, but at least on a superficial level where you understand how to get a sample set, how to take a moving average, or moving average might be complex for some, but how to average something and how to sort of understand some of these statistics. Yes, I'm using pie charts. It's not, it's breaking law. This is internally, though. This is really for us. We're trying to find, is there a story here? Is there something here that we need to discover in order to analyze this data more? I want this to be ugly. I even call this stuff fugly, so that before the ugly comes another word that we might or might not say. But I mean, it's sort of the point. 2 days later, AP came out with an article saying, well, okay, Madison.com said this about the 65%. We found different results. We found the first 4 days of this data. So this is only the first week, the first 7 days. The very first 4 days of this data, there was a 2-to-1 ratio of people against Scott Walker. The last 2 days, there was a 3-to-2 ratio of people in support of Scott Walker. So if you sort of do those numbers a little bit in your mind, it makes you sound like, well, a majority of the time people were against Scott Walker. And that's another way to spin the data. Both articles were true to the research that they did. And it's also the point that we need to really understand is that data is not truth. Data is our truth, and data is the story that we want to tell. A lot of times we get caught up thinking, well, there's data to prove it. It's like you can tell any story you want with data. So this is a story we're telling. We applied this data to a stream graph. If people aren't familiar with stream graphs, they're very useful in looking at volume over time. So you can see these kind of look like sausage links. These are each day of the week. And the little links are like night. You know, I think you have, every now and then you have like a little bitty bump at like 2 in the morning. I don't know, kids are crying, parents wake up, they want to write a letter to Scott Walker. These are all emails that went to Scott Walker. And I'm going to kind of jump around here, but this little bump right here is immediately after he submitted his budget proposal. It's green because he had an autoresponder in his email saying, I'm out of the office right now. So suddenly you had this surge of emails coming to his office, and there was that. And then you can see through the day, this little bump here was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Some students from campus came there and decided to walk around the square for a little bit. Or sorry, I think it was brought to their attention at this time. It was on the evening news, actually. And you can sort of see here, you're like, yes, these first few days, it's very majority blue. Blue, obviously, I'm associating it to Democrats, but these were not all Democrats who wrote against Scott Walker. There were actually quite a few Republicans, too. And then you can start to see it change. He had a press conference here, and then here he went on Fox News. And it opened up everything. And so it's really interesting to see, like, this is that data. And this is sort of what the AP was talking about as far as the 2-to-1 and the 3-to-2. But you can see at the last 2 days, the volume is excessive. I mean, compared to the other days, like, relatively speaking. Since we also had in-state and out-of-state, this was another way to look at the data. Red, the Wisconsin color, sort of, is, I'm not really from Wisconsin, so. I've been there for about 6 years. Red badger color are the people writing to Scott Walker in the state. And we would read it, and it was amazing that most of the emails you can tell whether they're in-state or out-of-state. If someone's saying, hey, you need to control your teachers or your taxpayers, we don't do that here in Arizona, you can tell they're out of state. Or if someone says, hey, you're going to affect my job by doing this bill. I can't pay my bills because of your job. We can assume that they're in the state. There's no absolute perfect way of categorizing all of those unless we go out and interview each person like 3 times, to have an absolute margin of zero, or margin of error to equal 0. But with this way, we were able to have a margin of error extremely minimal compared to all these natural language processing tools. They have like a 20% error rate, which it was just unacceptable. So this is our volume, and these are just emails. And one of the problems that I still had with this the whole time is like, yes, Scott Walker is right. I don't want him to be right. I just, personally, obviously I don't want him to be right, I want him to be wrong. But these are just emails. There's one factor that people were not talking about in this whole thing, and that is all of these people outside of the Capitol protesting constantly. He had 50,000 emails in a week. This is one day of about 120,000. So the Madison Police Department had this data open, they just announced really, what was the number of estimated people protesting outside. So I plugged in that data. Okay, now this is how I want to show it. So this new shade of blue is the number of protesters. And obviously you don't have the number throughout the entire day, so this is like an anomaly we have to work with. We know the peak, and we can sort of divert it throughout the day so that we can get some sort of sense of how it is. And being somebody out there protesting myself and riding my bike through these protesters every day when I was trying to get home, like, get out of my way, I support you guys, but I need to go home, I'm hungry. It was just sort of our way of saying, well, there's this other set of data on top of this. And what I added here too, this is sort of the annotation that Amanda Cox was talking about, is, what were the total emails on these days? What were some of the key things that happened? This is the day that the Democratic senators fled the state. And I think they were gone for about 3 weeks or so. You see that bump over here, it's February 14th. This is when a bunch of students came out. And Madison's a very liberal kind of hippie town. And the kids were like holding up signs like, we love you, Scott Walker, don't break our hearts. they didn't realize where things were going. This was like the early stages, those first few days. But you can even see here how this size, this volume size, dwarfs those, even much more now than it did before. It's an interesting way to look at this kind of data. Okay, done with that. We're going to come back to the test. So now do you guys remember everything that you saw with the test? I'm going to go through these slides again, and I am going to have one of these images or numbers or whatever is one that you saw. Another one is one that you did not see. There are 6 and then 6 again. So try in your mind to count how many that you actually remember from these. Okay, ready? This is the first one. And you can look at it for a minute if you need to. I don't think you do. Remember that? Remember which one you saw? No? Okay, so from that list, how many remembers one of those items? Okay, how many remembers 2? 3? 4? Whoa, I need to hire you. 5? Anything more than 5? Okay, now here are the images. Cute, huh? Trabants, abstract. Okay, how many remembers one of those? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, great. This is my point, is that our brains are hardwired to take very abstract and complex imagery and commit that to memory much more capable than it is committing just 4 or 5 digits. Especially diagrams and bar graphs. And it's really important to understand the brain itself and doing what it is that we do. Understand that the brain consumes 22% of our body mass, but yet it consumes 20% of our body's oxygen. It's a very, very process-intensive organ of our body, and some can argue that all of our other organs in our body basically serve our brain at a nonstop basis. The point is being that our brains are capable of understanding very complex notions. And it's not always necessary just to dumb things down to a bare minimum. When it deals with technology and new things that we have to interact with, like usability and user experience, absolutely. We need to make that experience very enjoyable and understandable to our brains who are just learning this for the first time. But for imagery, it's amazing how much our brains can actually process. So, keep that in mind. The other thing, too, to really note here is just as we communicate with each other, we're using visual cues all the time, metaphors. We use these all the time to really make a point to people when we're talking, barking up the wrong tree. Who's barking? Nobody's barking, but we know what that means. You're pushing my buttons. One of my favorite ones, to take the wind out of someone's sails. We're not physically doing this. I don't have buttons on me, but we know what that means, and very often we will actually have a visual image of that activity in our brain as we're talking about that. It helps us understand the story much better and to communicate between each other. That said, I'll actually show some of our work. Moving sort of from the political, but kind of still staying on the media scale itself, there's been a lot of talk this last year, or a couple of years actually, about the Quran. Especially for conservative groups, explain that the Quran is a book of terror, and it's a book that promotes violence and rape and all kinds of atrocities. And that's what incites Muslims to do all these terrible things to us. I grew up in the Deep South, Arkansas, which is very, very deep. And for a good part of my childhood, I had to go to a Baptist church. Yeah, a big reason why I'm atheist today, but that's another story. Ask me about it later. No, I wasn't touched in any inappropriate way, but all I'm saying is that that's not Baptist. But anyways, so I grew up in this church, and it was funny. People actually made fun of me when I was a kid because they would call me the grubworm, because I actually read the Bible. I was very interested in it as a literary text. I never felt really compelled by, oh, this guy must have really, split the ocean and walked on there, even though there's probably 3 feet of sediment and mud at the bottom. But for me, it was a very great literary story, and I understood the morale behind it. But in a Baptist church, in a lot of other religions as well, especially Christian faith, there's a lot of hell and damnation that's taught. And I remember very clearly when I was a kid this fear that they would instill. And I'm like, wait, if the Quran is so violent, how does it compare up to the Bible? So we built this application that we took the King James Version of the Bible, and we took an English translation of the Quran that was made by a British person at approximately the same time, so that linguistically we would have some similar words here. This is the entire book of the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament. This is the entire book of the Quran. So you can see the Quran is much shorter. It's about the size of the New Testament. Each one of these little squares is a verse. If you really wanted to, and you had a lot of patience, and you just had that will inside of you, and Jesus was helping, you could read the entire Bible and the entire Quran. But still, that's the point. It's accessible. Both texts are accessible in one screen, basically. And what we initially wanted to do was to have like a keyword, and I want to use a word like fight or terror or bomb or something. I want to see, or I don't think bomb would show up in these, but you get my point. Sometimes I just totally talk, and I'm like, I'm not listening to myself. But and I wanted to see the frequency of those words in both texts. But that one word alone, fight, isn't good enough. I need conjugations of fight. I need different variations. So we found this API called the Wordnik API. It's a synonym API. It's awesome. You type in a word, it spits back synonyms of fight. So we have fought, fighting, fights, engagement, combat, and that helps. Now we have a list of words similar to this one word. Now let's search the entire text for that. It'll highlight where those are. You can roll over one of these verses and actually read it if you're curious. And then we have our stats at the top. So we can see here, relatively speaking, which one has more than the other as far as fight. And just our general stats at the top as well. Really useful. I'll actually demo this really quick too if I have time. I think I can really quick. The other thing too, whenever we're building applications, and this is just like a really quick tip, make sure that what you're building doesn't do what it shouldn't do. So you type in a word like muffin top. This year, muffin top was added to the Oxford Dictionary. Okay, it's a word. And you can see here even there's no space, and that's intentional. When it goes through the text, we condense everything so that we try to get accurate patterns within there. And of course, nothing has muffin top. I was hoping Jesus would ride a skateboard at some point, but that didn't show up either. I'll just show you how this works really quick. And it's just sort of a point. Is the Quran more violent than the Bible? So we can type in a word like war. And okay, the Bible uses much more references to war. This is a little bit more of just like an analytical tool. Terror. Ooh, the Quran has more than terror, but how much? This is 0.18%. One of the very interesting things that I found as I was going through this is this word.
You can't quite see the results.
Yeah, sorry, it's cut off. Yeah, don't blame me, blame the resolution. Yeah. So here's forgive, and you can see the Quran has a far greater instance of forgive than the Bible does. The Bible doesn't talk a whole lot about forgiveness, except for when like Jesus comes. So before him, like whoa. And there was even another one that's interesting. These like God hates bags people or something. They're like, well, it says in the Bible, and so you can type in a word like this. Wait, I did not spell that right. Can somebody spell that for me really quick? Was it? It might be that it's not hitting the API now because of the internet connection. But there is one, basically the point is that there's one instance of where sodomy is referenced in the Bible, one, and it's in Deuteronomy. And like the verse next to it is like, if your wife talks against you, drag her to the street in the public square and beat her with stones, It's like, oh, okay. and gays are bad. So it's just interesting how we take things that we want to, and this is just part of our human nature. We take things that we want to and we try to make sense of it. Or we try to explain and justify our beliefs based on one little nugget that, if you put it in its context, is insane. Another work that we did is we managed to get the data set for the Billboard pop chart song titles from 1890 to 2009. This was a huge data set. So the Billboard pop chart song titles is, does everyone here know what that is, or does anyone not know what Billboard is? Have you heard of that? We grew up, Chasey Chasem, I think, was part of that, yeah. I was really fascinated with the fact that we had stuff all the way back at 1890. So we started doing these sort of word frequency analysis as well with this. And there's an artist in Berlin, his name is Boris Mueller. He's one of my favorite data artists out there, and he built this really nice visual on Goethe's Faust, the Book of Faust. And he put all these words in this particular order and frequency that are in that book. And I remember I wrote an email one time, and I was like, I really want a poster of this. And he was like, send me a Tufte book, and I'll send you back a couple of posters. And I was like, Tufte? I don't like him. Here. No, actually, I like Tufte. I'm just giving him a hard time because he gives me a hard time. So this was 1890, the decade of 1890. So you can see the very most common ones like thee, you, and my. But then we have, once you start looking down in it, you have words like uncle and Reuben, Josh. It's like, it's really fascinating when you start to see this. The other really fascinating thing too, and I'm not going to show you all of these, is as you go through each decade, the thee and the I, or the thee and the you suddenly transform where I becomes the dominant one from the 1970s. Because that's the me culture starts to take effect, where all these songs are about me and my heart and my love, and love is always a big one. But we did combine all of these song titles, and you can see here, just to explain this, actually I didn't explain this so much. So you take all the words in all these song titles, and you put them into like an array. And each time that word happens, an occurrence of that word happens, you make it larger and larger and larger, and then you sort them by level of frequency. This is just a straight up interpolation way of sizing things. So we had a top size of a text, a small size of a text, and then we start to map those values in between. So you can see thee is much larger than you. But then when we wanted to, we applied a logarithmic scale in this, which is like a sequential, a sequential step down from the top to the smallest. So it looks much smoother, it's much prettier, and this is the entire 1890 to 2009 data set. What's interesting about this is you can really go through this data, and you can actually read these words, not here obviously now, but on our printout you can read that. And we use this very often with our own analytical tools. Like, yes, this is beautiful. And people are like, this is beautiful, but how can I make this work for me? Like, what the hell? You're just wasting all this time on your pretty pictures. And I'm like, okay, here's Scott Walker's emails. Red is Republican words, very Republican. Blue is very Democratic. We have a hue value. Purple in the middle is like kind of a balance between both of them. And we took out some of the very common words like the and a and all that, and we sorted these in that way. So you can see like state, Walker, governor. Sometimes you can see, this is one that I kept seeing that word a lot, God bless you. Keep strong, stand strong, keep firm. There were so many emails that had that, thank, and it's interesting once you start going with this, and then the Democrats would be like bargaining and rights and students, and so we also applied this to an animation, and you'll see here what we do is we apply a physics library to this and processing, where we just kind of play with things too. It's okay to play. This may not make a lot of sense now, but now let's put these all on an x-axis and try to make sense of that. So now we can see Democrat, Republican, these are how the words are sorted, and release it, and it'll relax again. And it's sort of a good way to have fun, but at the same time try to analyze this stuff a little bit and try to create sort of engaging experiences. this is an ongoing project with the Walker emails, and it's going to be ongoing for a while. I'm glad that it's still fresh. I guess if he was like, I don't want to say the word assassinated because I don't ever want that to happen to anybody, but if something happened to him or he left the state, you know, he was accused of being in a bathroom stall and hitting on another male, you know, and he would leave very quickly, then maybe this would lose its flavor. But we have recall elections happening in Wisconsin. This summer, a couple of the senators are going to be recalled, the Republican ones. So it's definitely going to be an ongoing thing for us. And it's very interesting in the meantime for us to analyze this. And it's a great, great, great learning experience to really dig into human-created data, to data created by us and our brains, and the way we think and the way we write words. You know, it's not that easy. Like all these people think like, oh, we can just take Twitter feeds and make all this sense out of it. No, you can't. It's really not that easy, and anyone who's tried to do that realizes that very quickly. You have 140 characters, and you want to try to determine how people feel about your product. You know, there's sarcasm. There's so many ways. There's these visual metaphors. There's so many things that computers just simply can't analyze. And you know, we've been doing computational translation services for a very long time, and they still really suck. You know, and just because we're humans, you can't. We're not robots, and our language changes all the time. Another project, we did this for Wired Magazine, the 311 call project. Wired contacted us a few months back, and what the story was about was that New York had received its 100 millionth 311 call. Not every city has 311 yet, but it's basically 911 is an emergency number. So if your house is burning down, call 911. If you have a burning question, or someone's parked in your driveway, or there's a street light broken, call 311. They'll dispatch you to the right person, and then the police or fire department or somebody will help take care of that. It's a really great service, actually. So Wired sent me this data of 2 weeks of data from these 311 calls. It was great. It was really nicely formatted and whatnot, but we had 4 days to do anything with this. And I was like, and it was like a Thursday evening when he wrote me. He's like, can I get something by Monday? And I was like, there goes my weekend. But so the very first thing I did was we parsed the data, we analyzed it, and we started making some visuals. And this was the very first thing I did was I knew frequency. So I knew noise was this big compared to mold. People would call 311 about mold. And I was thinking, oh, it's a magazine, I'll do an illustrative piece. So we used like the geomeritive library in processing to outline 311, and I was like, hey, this looks kind of cool. And I did this, and I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool. And I sent this to Wired, and they were like, what does this mean? You know, explain this to me. And at that point, I was like, you're absolutely right. This means nothing. It's random. And that's not what we do. You know, this was sort of, you're on a timeline, and you're like, oh, you know, I need to make something pretty. And then suddenly you realize, wait, you slap yourself across the face. If this doesn't mean anything, there's no story behind it. And to try to say, well, you see these lines, there are 100 million of them, and that's what we're representing. No, this is abstract. This is data art. We're not artists. You know, at least that's not what I like to consider us. I actually like to think that the tools we build are very analytical in nature. So we started exploring stream graphs, because that just kind of seemed like the best case scenario, and this is one of our very first iterations of this data. And you can even see a couple glitches here in the data sets that we had to come back and fix and whatnot later. But this was sort of one of the very first composites that we did. And I was like, wow, this actually makes sense. After iteration, we came up with this. And a nice little concept piece, but it's very edgy. The colors are definitely not wired. After many, many, many iterations, this was the piece that we finally sent to them. I really like the colors here, and I like the fact that one of our techniques is to change the text size. We do this a lot in our work. The text size still helps emphasize that frequency. So you can see noise is still the hugest, where rodent is not so huge. And these are like the top, I think, 30 or 40 or something like that. And then Wired being who they are, they need to make their little changes, and their designers there have to have their little markings on it. So they took our labels out and they put a lot more pink and bright colors and all that, which this is still a beautiful piece. It was a lot of fun to work with. And I was really happy that we were given the chance. Stephen Johnson, the guy who wrote the article, is by far my favorite writer for Wired. He's an excellent writer, so it was a huge honor to be part of that. And it was a great learning experience. I mean, really short timeline. I think they bumped it from like 4 to 5.5 days, which was like, thank you, another day and a half, great. And we were still like ahead of schedule. So we use this technique still pretty often in other works that we do. This is one that we did for Fortune, and you can sort of see the same look and feel. This was a concept work that we did initially for them. They wanted to break down a ticket price of an airline ticket. This was the final piece that made the most sense. So this is literally a stacked bar graph, and we use these sort of jet patterns that create that. And it was actually a lot of fun doing this project too. It was very quick. This one we did in a very short amount of time. But yeah, we could have just kept it as a stacked bar graph. But that whole importance of that visual metaphor sinking into the brain and helping people understand that. No, I don't quite expect people to understand the exact values with this, but I expect them to be engaged in it. And that's with this particular piece, I want to draw people into that. If you just show a stacked bar graph, they're great. I'm not actually saying that bar graphs are necessarily bad. It's great if you need to make a quick decision. But if you're trying to tell a story to an audience, they're not so much fun. So I don't have too much time left, so I'm going to go through this project. Some people here might have already seen this, but I'll kind of talk about the process. US federal spending and media coverage. We had data from usaspending.gov. It was sort of another internal project where we were exploring government spending data. And what we did was, this was the data we pulled from usaspending.gov. It's just a big, chunky XML file. It was really ugly, actually, but we managed to work through it. And what I really wanted to do was kind of like reveal these corporations that the US military just owns. I had this idea in my mind, and once we started analyzing that data, this was one of the very first graphs that we made. So over here, the left graph these are departments that the federal government spends on, and these are different types of corporations. I think one is dollar amount and one is frequency of contracts. And when I first saw this, and this is really the point, you have to have data before you can concept anything. If you try to think and imagine something before you have that data, you're going to change. It's going to completely change that project. So very often when clients contact us, hey, can you start working on this and we'll send you data tomorrow? I'm like, no, we really have to have that data because otherwise we're going to have something else. I was looking at this, and when Nick and I were building this out, I was like, yeah, we got them. And wait, who the hell is this? It was sort of my next picture. That's the Department of Defense. So I was like, okay, let's build some visuals based on this. Hey, we're using a big circle. This was really an exploration for us. This was not for a client. This was us and our desire internally to experiment with new shapes and colors and patterns and whatnot to help understand it. So, and you can see at the bottom of these departments, you can't read those. Oh my God, we'd get emails from people like, this is terrible, I can't read any of this. This is awful. And my point is, there's no legend. I'm not trying to tell you what the percentage of the Department of Education was. My story here is, holy shit, Department of Defense, okay? That's the only story what this is saying. 70% of our federal contract spending goes to them. Looking at this a little bit closer, you can see that overlap. And we went a step further, and I wanted to see how much we talk about these in different media sources. So the New York Times has their API. So we hit the API, and we just put really kind of generic words that help try to explain these departments. It's definitely not a perfect system, but it was enough to give us a picture. So what we did was, this is the first thing that we mapped. Okay, Department of Defense is the biggest spender, but now look how evenly distributed these guys are, relatively speaking. So we put that in a visual, and this was the final piece that we did for that. But we went further, People were like, oh, those circles are terrible. I was like, okay, here. Oh, wait, no, what are you doing? And I was like, all right, here you go. Here's one without the circles. Actually, at our workshop tomorrow, I'm doing a workshop today, and tomorrow I'm going to go through this technique that we do here, sort of curves, lines, curves, and colors. And I'll talk a little bit about that in our workshop. We're doing like sort of tips and tricks. Last thing I want to talk about here is just sort of this call to arms and this idea of having real data to work with and how important that is. I got an email a couple weeks ago from let's just say a very well-known health magazine. I won't say anything more than that. And this was literally the email. I've attached a rough PDF of a quick mock-up we did here. Unfortunately, this data is not real, and we have quite a bit of work to get the editor to spin his current stats to something more infographic in nature like this. But you get the idea of where I want to take this. Are you interested? And my answer was just no data, no worky. I'm sorry, but this is already, it sounds really bad. And what I just tell clients is, listen, I'm a terrible improviser. I can't improvise. If I have data I can work with, I can process it, I can analyze it, that we do really, really well. We can do really large data sets, we can do smaller data sets, but we can't just make up something and then try to fit data. It doesn't work that way. It's putting the cart in front of the horse. And this is a metaphor I always sort of leave them with, is you need clay to make bricks. And if you don't have clay, you can't make bricks, you can't build a house. It's just going to collapse. That's it.